That's off with this slide. Pollution. Pollution was certainly an example of the tragedy of the commons, in which there was this concept that this belief that byproducts of industry could be discharged into the environment, which we still do, although it's highly regulated. And this course will get into that very much, particularly with the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. But it was done in a way that everything was discharged into the environment. Nothing was recycled, nothing was processed, nothing was cleaned up. And there was this concept that dilution was the solution to pollution. That if you just dumped your effluent into the river, it would be diluted, go downstream, and that would be the end of it. The problem is you'd end up with problems like this. This is the Cuyahoga River, which caught on fire multiple times because of petroleum-based products that were discharged by industry into the river. Now, petroleum, oils do not dissolve in water, and so they remain on the surface. They separate in water and remain near the surface, where they congregate, and of course they can ignite. A burning river, literally. And it wasn't just the Cuyahoga River. This happened around the world in places where these types of products were discharged into the environment. This just doesn't happen today, but it happened then. Tragedy of the commons in regards to how this river was being used. Here's a really extreme example. This is splash damming. This happened in Oregon and Washington. It happened in Pennsylvania. If you've ever been up to central Pennsylvania, there's a lot of evidence of splash damming. Essentially what this is back before the days of big trucks and things that could haul these logs away, they would go up into the forest in these steep areas, and they would harvest the trees, and they would just haul them down to the local river, and they would dump them in the riverbed. So this is actually a riverbed underneath here. There's a stream flowing underneath all these logs, and they would just dump the logs in the river. And they'd use pulley systems and so forth to get the logs down in here. Then they would go upstream, and they would build a dam, a temporary dam out of logs. And they would create a reservoir that would flood an entire valley and destroy the valley. And then they would use dynamite to blow up the dam and cause all that water in that reservoir, this huge, giant, catastrophic flood, to flood down the valley and capture all these logs and then flush them downstream, eventually into one of the larger rivers. Out west, it was usually the Columbia River, or even directly down into the ocean, where they could then be gathered up by boat and dragged over essentially to the mill to be processed. Unprecedented environmental degradation and damage that happened because of this type of logging. It didn't happen everywhere, but it did happen. Certainly an example of the tragedy of the commons. This is another tragedy. This is a vintage photograph of the Yankee Fork of the Salmon River in central Idaho, where I've actually been to this site, and although it looks much better today than it does in this photograph, it's not much better. So what happened is they create this little barge that digs these, it's kind of like, just digs these troughs in the floodplain back and forth across the floodplain along these rivers, because over thousands of years gold was deposited through geofluvial processes into the floodplain. And they figured out that if they went back and forth across this floodplain, they could basically dredge out the landscape, crush the rocks, use chemicals to leach out the gold and other types of ores from the rocks and process those, and then leave all the waste behind. This caused utter devastation in some of these floodplains, and this was a fairly common practice. Again, self-interest outweighing the general good. And this is a good place to bring this other concept up called the public trust doctrine. The public trust doctrine is something that you need to know about, and it's going to come up all the time. And the reason why this introduction is so heavy on the tragedy of the commons and now the public trust doctrine is because that's what this class is really all about. Environmental law is designed to protect the public trust and to prevent the tragedy of the commons, essentially. And there's two types of environmental laws. There's natural resource law, and there's pollution law. And in kind of a nutshell, and we're going to go through this a little bit later, but essentially the public trust doctrine is that this emerged out of the 1800s, and kind of existed for a long time. But it wasn't until some legal cases in the late 1800s and early 1900s established what this public trust doctrine is. And go to another photo so you're not getting bored here staring at the same one. But the public trust doctrine is that this it goes back to the Constitution, in which through the Constitution the states are given or mandated authority to hold in trust for you and I natural resources. So, for example, whales, turkeys, birds, forests, clean water. Where's the clean water here? Oh, that's dirty water, but clean water. All these things, forests, belong to the people. And they're held in trust by the state. Now, it started with fish and wildlife, and if you think back all the way back into Europe, for example, the story of Robin Hood, the reason why Robin Hood in the story got in trouble with the king initially was because he shot the king's deer. The deer belonged to the king, and the king was mad at Robin Hood for doing that. Well, it's pretty typical back in feudal times that everything belonged to the king. Now, the public trust doctrine says that no, actually, clean air, clean water, healthy forests, and particularly fish and wildlife belong to the people, collectively, to each one of us. And that the states, through the Constitution, are mandated to hold in trust those resources. That's why we have fish and wildlife agencies. That's why we have, state, for example, Massachusetts, we have the Department of Environmental Protection. These are designed to protect us from ourselves, from overutilizing our own resources and violating the public trust, which is essentially our self-interest violating the common good, the greater good of the people in general. Here's an example. This is the Love Canal. We're going to talk about this later in the semester. The Love Canal was an example of a chemical company dumping, I think it's 20,000 tons of chemical waste and then burying it in an old canal called the Love Canal that was never finished. And it caused all sorts of horrible pollution problems and degradation, and to the point that 900 people had to be relocated by declaration of President Carter. Nuclear fallout. We were testing during the Cold War. We were testing nuclear bombs like crazy in the Marshall Islands and Utah desert and Nevada desert. And Barry Commoner, who was a professor at New York University, was studying the fallout of nuclear testing and found that chemicals from nuclear testing were entering the food chain, essentially, and particularly influencing pregnant mothers and their nursing children. And it was so bad that they stopped the testing because of the work that he did. And it was so influential that he was put on the Time magazine. Again, sometimes people get really frustrated that those darn environmentalists out there, trying to stop progress. Well, most of the time, they're trying to protect us from ourselves, because a lot of the things that we do end up coming back to hurt us. It isn't always about protecting some rare bird or an endangered snail, which it can be, and that can be a good thing too. But sometimes it's about protecting us from ourselves, and trying to get decided to do things in a more sustainable way. Rachel Carson is a great example of this, and you're going to watch a video about her, and this is a wonderful example of this. Rachel Carson, this was back in the early 60s. She wrote a book called Silent Spring in 1963 that exposed the problem of a chemical called DDT that was widely used to control insects and to protect crops from insects. And it worked so well that DDT really is what eradicated malaria from the modern world. It was so effective. The problem is it was causing all sorts of problems with raptors, and not just raptors, but a lot of organisms. It was causing problems with alligators and amphibians and other aquatic reptiles. But what it did is it gets into the food web, and it bioaccumulates in tissues and biomagnifies as you go up the food web into higher predators. And it was causing a softening of the eggshells of raptors, to the point that when the raptors were incubating the eggs and resting on the eggs, that the eggs would be crushed and would kill the young. It caused so many problems that there was catastrophic declines of raptors throughout North America and the world, as well as alligators and other types of animals, that egg-bearing animals. And her book essentially stopped that. Silent Spring was published, and the president, which was Kennedy at the time, issued an order that a committee look into the validation of her book. They confirmed that what she was saying was true, and DDT was banned. It's been banned since the early 70s, and raptor populations are recovering dramatically simply from the banning of that chemical. Rachel Carson was saving us essentially from ourselves. During the day, she was demonized in a way that you can barely even imagine by the chemical companies and by proponents of the chemical companies. And she died of cancer at a fairly young age, partly, many people believe, because of the fight against these companies. And today, these raptor populations are recovering dramatically. We'll learn more about Rachel Carson in the near future. So all of these problems, all of these concerns, both natural resource problems with fish and wildlife, with forests, with clean water, as well as pollution problems that have a direct and immediate impact on you and I, led to, in the 60s and 70s, this massive wide environmental movement that led to the passing of all sorts of environmental laws unanimously. The country was just ready for this kind of nonsense to end. I mean, this is just ridiculous to live in a world where this kind of stuff is happening, right? I mean, it's just crazy. And so the country was ready to pass massive environmental laws to resolve these problems. And that's what this class is about. The solution to the tragedy of the common and the violation of the public trust are laws and enforcement. Now, in a perfect world, we'd all be watching out for each other, and we'd act in a sustainable way. We wouldn't be putting our self-interests above the greater good. But that's not the world we live in. And so some types of laws and agencies that regulate those laws are required to provide a solution to the tragedy of the commons. Now, today, because of these laws and these efforts and the enforcement associated with that, we have cleaner water than we have had in the last 150 years. Really, our water is much cleaner. Now, there's still problems, and we still have to deal with these problems. You've probably seen examples of like the Animas River turning orange in Colorado because of mine tailings flooding through the river. And but in general, our water's cleaner, our air's cleaner than they have been in a long, long time. Our ancestors, our grandparents, and our great-grandparents did not have, in general, the clean water and the clean air that we have today. Peregrine falcons have recovered. Their numbers have returned. They've been delisted from the Endangered Species Act. Bald eagles have been delisted from the Endangered Species Act. You can see, look at these graphs. Back when DDT was a thing, they crashed. When DDT was banned in the 70s, their numbers began to increase. They're back. The humpback whale is on a trajectory of recovering. They're doing much better than they did back during the times of whaling when they were over-harvested. We're protecting large swaths of land like the Everglades. $8 billion has been earmarked, well, it's actually being utilized today to restore the Everglades and the hydrology of the Everglades. Wolf populations, we're going to talk about wolf populations, the reintroduction of wolves in the Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. Their numbers are skyrocketing, and this is out of date if we went current. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to pick this up in the next lecture.